Good afternoon again. We resume our discussion of the Vietnam War. And carrying over from last time, are there any matters, things that were not clear to you or at point you'd like to raise, anything like that? Good. Okay, let's get going. At the conclusion of the last lecture, I was discussing American foreign policy with respect to Indochina, and clearly we understood that and certainly the Viet Minh understood that the United States held the future of Indochina in its hands. Its attitude would, because of its great power at the end of the 1945, it was going to more or less determine the fate of Indochina. And so, of course, the Viet Minh issuing this Declaration of Independence, in terms of foreign reception, they were looking toward the United States. And so far as the United States went, we discussed Roosevelt, and Roosevelt was an anti-colonialist, both for idealistic reasons. Generally, he was anti-colonialist, but he felt that, in particular, with respect to Indochina, the French had abused their position. They were exploiters and so on, and that it would be better for the people of Indochina to be under a UN trusteeship. The UN was in the process of being created, and beyond that, that is to say, they would be administered by some country while being prepared for independence. That was Roosevelt's position. And of course, also important is American overall policy, which was anti-colonial, not only because of sort of idealistic reasons, but also because getting rid of these colonial empires would open them up to American investment and American exports. And so free trade was the American attitude. Now, in terms of American foreign policy in this area, of course, at this point, Japan sues for peace with the atomic bombing, and they become a complete dependency. They're occupied by the Americans and are basically subordinated to American Asia. America wins, seems to be supreme. And in terms of American attitudes, you can see clearly how the way they dealt with the Philippine Islands. They had taken them in 1898, and now in 1946, they give the Philippines its independence politically, because they're committed to this, it looks like they're committed to this anti-colonial policy. Of course, yes, they give them political independence, but from then to this day, the Philippines has been politically independent, but as a matter of fact, from an economic and military point of view, the Philippine Islands is an American base. It's really what it is. So that is the dynamic here. One more point needs to be made. Of course, the United States was the main supporter of China against Japan. And the government of China was the nationalist government, or the KMT, Kuomintang, as it was called, Kuomintang. And the Kuomintang was extremely dependent on American support, American military and economic aid, and the United States expected China to be completely open to American investment and manufacturing at the end of the war. China was the great prize. So that's the overall picture. However, when Roosevelt died, American policy towards Vietnam and the rest of Indochina dramatically changed. Roosevelt dies, and Harry Truman becomes the president of the United States. And Truman was not well informed about foreign policy. He listened to his advisors, and in other words, the State Department and so on. And there was a rejection of Roosevelt's policy of with respect to Indochina, with respect to colonialism or anti-colonialism, because the Americans began almost immediately to give the French support in Vietnam, in Indochina. Although they did not say this in public, in private, they began to give very considerable support to the French. And I want to develop this point a little bit. And why was that? Why did they change dramatically from essentially being anti-French in Indochina? Suddenly they're supporting the French. Well, this had nothing to do with Indochina. It had everything to do with France and the state of France at the end of World War II. Number one, France had been defeated and occupied and economically bled by Germany, humiliated, and even worse was the fact that in the course of the war and in the immediate aftermath of the war, the communists became very strong in France. In the first election after the war, the French Communist Party won almost 30% of the vote. It was the best organized party. It had enormous influence. The French resistance, most of it had basically been created by the Communist Party during the war. So the prestige of the communists was very high. The major consideration for the United States was preventing the communists from taking over in France right after the war. And this situation would remain a factor, an important factor, really until at least the middle of the 1950s. For the first 10 years after the post-war, the communist threat was taken very seriously in Washington. This is the beginning of the Cold War, and the communists seem a threat worldwide, particularly in post-war Europe. And so this is the American position, and they begin to initiate their policy, what they call, the Americans do, of containing communism, containing both the internal threat of communism. The communists were particularly strong in Italy and in Greece. In those three countries, the communists were very strong. And also, the Soviet Union had fought a brilliant war. They broke the back of the Nazis on the Eastern Front. The Red Army was 5 or 6 million troops strong, and they were standing at the Elbe River. And so, from the American point of view, in the first place, preventing a communist takeover within France, and also building up France, especially the right wing in French politics, of course, were anti-communist, was extremely important to the Americans. And they ultimately wanted France to become militarily, along with the rest of Western Europe, to become a bulwark against the possible advance of the Red Army, which of course ultimately leads to the creation of NATO in 1949. And meanwhile, the right wing in French politics, does anybody know who the major figure was in France, on the right in France after the war?
Was it
Yes,
was it de Gaulle?
yes, exactly. General de Gaulle, who, unlike most right-wing people in France, who had basically compromised themselves with Germany, the occupying power, de Gaulle had fled to England and organized what was called the Free French. And he collaborated with the communists during the war to fight the Germans. But he was, of course, he was a traditionalist, and he detested the communists and so on. So necessarily, the Americans looked to him, and de Gaulle and those around him basically said, unless you support us, both within the country and in terms of our empire, help us maintain our empire, we will become weaker, and we cannot. They were playing on the Americans in this way. You need to support us in Indochina, and the Americans basically accepted this position. While this became the new American position, supporting the French in Indochina, at the same time, the more liberal of Truman's advisors said that the French should basically concede self-government. The French should continue to control overall, but they should give internal self-government to the Vietnamese. That was the compromise position from the American point of view. You'll see how this worked out. So what I'm basically saying is the Americans are doing everything possible to support the French. And therefore, I want at this point, as a kind of parenthesis, something happened in the last week, which something dramatic in terms of relations between the United States and France, which has serious implications. Does anybody know what this is?
Is it the US selling like nuclear powered submarines to Australia, undercutting the French?
Exactly. The French were on the verge of completing a deal to sell advanced technology submarines, not nuclear, to the Australians. You know that the big American policy is to contain capitalist China. I'll say that. They 50, 60 years ago, they were interested in containing communist China. Now they're trying to contain capitalist China. Well, they're building up militarily all through the Pacific and trying to rim in China, contain them. I mean, to me, this is complete folly, but this is what they're doing. And part of this is Australia is central to this. So what they did is the French were about to do this deal with the Australians, and instead the Americans undercut them. And the Australian government said, we're buying American submarines, not French. Well, in the wake of that, the French have recalled their ambassador to the United States and their ambassador to Australia. They're furious. The French foreign minister said, this is a stab in the back. And I guess a lot of the motive is that this deal is worth a lot of money. But to me, it is a staggering thing for the Americans to do, because France has been central to American post-war policy. And there have been a lot of tensions in Europe with respect to both the European Union and NATO. And this event may, now it could be that they'll work out some sort of a compromise, but you need to watch this because this could be the end of NATO. It's already sort of shaky. And we could see the French, who know how to play, they invented the game of power politics. There, you could see them moving towards Moscow or towards Beijing as a result of what's just happened. I'm not by any means certain that that's going to happen, but it's a chessboard, and you have to be aware of how things are moving. But I digress. This is a parenthesis. Unless somebody wants to discuss this more, does anybody want to raise some questions about this and so on? The world is really changing, I guess the overall point has to be made. You can't take anything for granted these days. Maybe you never could, I don't know. But, anybody have any comment or, okay. So
I actually had a question. Sorry, I didn't speak up too fast. But I want to know if was any of the funding that France was receiving from the U.S. Part of the Marshall Plan at all for Indochina?
Absolutely. They pretended that they gave the French something like $6 billion. They gave the West Germany, about $8 billion. These are the two major recipients of post-war loans and Marshall Plan aid, loans and grants. And a considerable fraction of what was given to the French basically was used to build up French forces in Vietnam, to take back Vietnam. So this was the very next point I was going to make. American ships ferried French troops to Indochina. The Americans gave them many merchant vessels, something like 75 merchant vessels to move equipment and troops to Indochina. As I said, they gave them all this money. And it was all related to building up France in the first instance. And then a little bit later, when China fell to the communists, that's 1949. We're talking still in 1945, but in 49, the communists take over China. Then it becomes, well, we not only have to contain the communists in Europe, we have to contain them in Asia. And keeping Indochina French is fundamental to the idea of containing communism, which is now controlling these two very large Eurasian countries, the USSR and China. So the Americans, with the beginning of the Cold War, they backed the French in Indochina. And we should note that they did the same thing with the Dutch. The major Dutch colony was Indonesia, which they had held since the 17th century. Well, there was a nationalist and a communist movement in Indonesia. The Americans reinforced the Dutch in Indonesia. In Malaya, no sooner did the war end, Malaya was controlled by the British, Malaya and Singapore, a communist insurgency developed there. The British were trying to control it, and the Americans gave them support. They gave them money, they gave them military help in order to help their European allies, the Dutch, the British, and the French. That was what happened to American foreign policy. Now, as for the French themselves, I don't think that Indochina was that valuable from an economic point of view. But in terms of French prestige, was at a low point, and the French had lost their status as a great power. They had once upon a time been the dominant power on the continent of Europe. All of that disappeared. They were, from the perspective of national prestige and so on, things were very bad. So the French wanted to hold on to their possessions in Indochina, but also in West Africa. The whole of West Africa was basically controlled by them, all these countries in West Africa. And I made the point earlier, it still is controlled by them, even though these states are nominally independent. The reality is, behind the scenes, France really pulled the strings. But also very important was North Africa. And there were 3 countries there that they controlled, Tunisia, Morocco, and Algeria. And they were afraid that if they gave independence to Vietnam, these countries would begin to demand their independence. In fact, they did. And some of you know that a terrible war broke out in between the French and the Arabs in Algeria, the so-called Algerian War, which was similar to the war in Vietnam. In any case, this was the overall situation. Now, in going back to Vietnam proper, what we find there is that the Viet Minh basically take over the north and the center. Tonkin and Annam, they set up the Viet Minh dominate militarily, and they set up a state administration. But they could not do the same in the south, in Cochin, Saigon, and this whole region, whose significance I explained earlier. This region was contested. The Viet Minh didn't have the strength to take over in this region. And who was contesting them? Well, here there was the VND-QQ, the Divet, the conservative nationalists, the more conservative nationalists, didn't want the Viet Minh, who they understood were communists. But also there were some Japanese remnants around. Some Japanese troops are still there, and they wouldn't allow the Viet Minh to take over. And there were also these armed Buddhist sects, variants of Buddhism, who had very large numbers of followers, and they were anti-communist. And so together, all these groups were resisting a Viet Minh takeover of the South. Most of the French who were still in Vietnam were in concentration camps, who were just being let out at this point. And they, of course, were opposed as well. So you have that as well. Now, very soon after the war, the Germans surrendered in May. In early July, the 4 big powers, the United States, Great Britain, the Soviet Union, and France was included to build it up, met just outside of Berlin at a place called Potsdam. It's a suburb of Berlin in the conquered Germany. You see it spelled here. There were many items on the agenda. They were basically settling the details of the occupation of Germany and Japan and what would happen after the war, etc. And Vietnam was on the agenda. At Potsdam, it was decided that the northern part of Vietnam would be administered for an indeterminate but temporary period by troops from nationalist China. 20,000 Chinese troops crossed the frontier and nominally took over the northern part in behalf of the Allies. And the British, coming from India, were given the mission of basically establishing order in South Vietnam. So the country, in a way, the Allies, in a way, sort of divide the country in the middle. The KMT, the Chinese troops, they had their own problems in China. And so they did send these 20,000 troops, but they sat on their hands and basically did nothing and allowed the Viet Minh to consolidate the administration of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. So the whole of the North really, although the Chinese were present, they soon withdrew. Does anybody know why they were needed in China? Why did these troops quickly return to China? What would be the reason?
Was it because there was a communist revolution going on they need to go back for?
Exactly. When I said they had their own problems, that was the problem. And so they scuttled back to China because the communist threat kept getting more and more serious. But in the South, the British did arrive. The name of the officer who led the British expedition they came from India. On the 13th of September, British troops arrived under Major General Douglas Gracie in Saigon. They arrived in the large city in the south. And Gracie, who was he was a British officer of the old school, and certainly believed in imperialism, and he was openly racist toward the Vietnamese. Basically, the idea that the Viet Minh would be taking over and establishing their government in the South was simply not on. And so Gracie then proceeds to basically allow the French. He uses his troops. He uses Japanese troops who are still there, now under his control. He uses any Frenchman who is willing to bear arms. He puts this whole thing together, and basically he suppresses the Viet Minh in South Vietnam. The Viet Minh put up a certain resistance, but they simply don't have the strength to fight the French at this point. And of course, Gracie is under the orders of the British government. And this is reflecting back to last time. The British attitude was, we have to help the French get back in Indochina, because if the French lose Indochina, we're going to lose India, and we're going to lose our other imperial possessions. So the French and the British have to help one another in trying to hold on to their respective empires. And by the end of 1945, there's something like 50,000 French troops with American help and with the British administering have entered South Vietnam by the end of 1945. Now, as this is going on, the French and the Viet Minh agree, well, we have to negotiate. There's nothing for it. Let's say the Viet Minh have established the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, and now the French are contesting this. The French and the British, they have now the forces we can't take over, particularly the South. So a negotiation opens. Ho Chi Minh travels to France, and there is this negotiation. And in March 1946, there is an agreement between the Viet Minh and the French government. And in the first place, the Viet Minh agree that temporarily the 15,000 French troops can basically, moving out of the South, they can establish themselves in the north of Vietnam. The French are now well established in Cochin, in that area. But now the Viet Minh say, well, you can come up to some relatively small number of troops can reestablish themselves on the coast of North Vietnam. But in return for that, the French recognize the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. They say this, I'm quoting now. The Democratic Republic of Vietnam is a free state having its own government, parliament, army, and finances. But now this is the kicker, and forming part of the still to be established Indochina Chinese Federation and the French Union. In other words, the French recognize the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, but only as part of the French Union. In other words, as part of the French Empire, Vietnam will become one of the states of this French Union, and it will have essentially internal autonomy, sort of the way Canada existed until after the First World War. Canada had still a limited sovereignty within the Commonwealth. Well, that's the deal that the French signed with the Viet Minh in March of 1946. They also, because this had been one of the bones of contention, the French said that whatever happens to Vietnam, we should realize that the very South, where we are, is actually based on, and they invoked various regionalism. They said Cochin was really independent of the rest of Vietnam. And the Viet Minh had no rights to the very South. But now they said, well, we'll allow the people to decide. There can be a plebiscite. The people here can decide whether or not they want to belong to the rest of Vietnam. So that was the deal, at least ostensibly. But as the strength of the French increased, as the French buildup continued, and as I said, they were already reestablishing themselves in the north and were well entrenched in Cochin, they began to ignore this deal as if it had never happened. They refused, for example, to hold the plebiscite in Cochin. They basically would not allow really the French set up, reestablished their own administration, and this autonomy turned out to be worth nothing but a piece of paper. It was clear that what the French really had in mind was the full reestablishment of French control over the whole of Vietnam, north and south. So that's, in other words, in the course of 1946, things are deteriorating. The negotiations break off and so on. We're really right on the edge of open conflict between the Viet Minh and the returning French. Meanwhile, one should note that what was the attitude of the Soviet Union towards these events? Obviously, the Soviet Union was watching these events with interest and so on. So we have to ask, and we've seen the American attitude. The Americans affected the kind of neutralism, but just a second. Behind the scenes, they were supporting the French. Well, the Soviet Union basically ignored the situation in Vietnam, and that was basically for two or three reasons. First of all, they were much more concerned. Instead of being concerned about Vietnam, they were much more concerned about what was going on in Korea, which is, of course, right on the border of the Soviet Union. Korea borders, or is very close, well, it borders Korea. And there, a civil war situation was developing. And so they were concerned about what was going on in their border more than, well, South Vietnam was, relatively speaking, far away. Secondly, the people who are really concerned with Vietnam were the Chinese communists. And so, and the Chinese communists were deeply attached to the Soviet Union. So the Soviets said to the Chinese, they said to Mao, you take care of Vietnam. That's your baby, because we're concerned elsewhere. It was a division of labor. So they allowed the Chinese to take care of things. And of course, as they could, the Chinese communists helped the Viet Minh, their fellow communists. But the final reason has to do with, the situation in France. The Soviet Union thought that the communists had good prospects in France, and I've explained how popular they were. And as a matter of fact, between 1945 and 1947, they were so popular that, in fact, the governments in France during that year, there were several communist ministers sitting in the French government. And so the popularity, the Soviets didn't want to jeopardize the popularity of the French communists. So they went along with whatever they decided. And if you can believe it, the French communists basically opposed, they said, well, autonomy should be actually given to the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, but it is part of the French Empire. The communists took that position in order to retain their popularity. And when the war broke out, and it broke out in November of 1946, the first shots were fired on the 26th of November, 1946. The communists supported de Gaulle and the French generals rather than the Viet Minh. So this was, from the point of view of the communist movement, a betrayal. Of course, the socialists also, they were as much in favor of the French Empire as was de Gaulle. All of the parties in France supported this. This was the overall situation. it only really changed when the communists in China took over the government in China. Immediately, the Mao Zedong immediately, upon taking power, recognized the Democratic Republic of Vietnam as the legitimate government, and the Soviet Union followed 2 weeks after China recognized the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. So too did the Soviet Union, but they left it to the Chinese. The Chinese and the Soviets were strong allies at this point, and the Soviets basically went along with what the Chinese attitude was. Well, negotiations by the fall of 1946 broke off. The French sent they had already had some troops in the north. You can see here, this there is a port in the north. It's called Haiphong, the port of Haiphong. It's the port of the major northern city, Hanoi, which was de facto the capital of the Democratic Republic of the North. Well, the French brought up a very strong fleet with tens of thousands of troops, and in late November, they presented the Democratic Republic with an ultimatum: get out of Haiphong. And the Vietnamese, the Viet Cong, refused, and the French bombarded and occupied the port of Haiphong. That was the beginning of the war. They killed about 6,000 people when this happened. And then a couple of weeks later, they marched and occupied Hanoi. And so December 1946, the beginning of the French war against the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, a war 8 years. This conflict continued between 1946 and 1954. And this is what we're going to be considering now. So we looked at the development of the national liberation struggle between 1925 and 1945. We've now looked at the sort of lead up to the war, and now we're looking at the French War, which of course is then in its turn the lead up to direct American involvement. So the war began, and I would say from the beginning that the war went on all over Vietnam, but the main theater of the war was the North. Control over the North was regarded both by the Viet Minh and by the French as critical, in particular because the North was right next to China, and if the Viet Minh had access to China, and especially after the Chinese Revolution, this China could become the rear area of the Viet Minh. And how could the French control China? They couldn't. And so suppressing the Viet Minh in this region was critical. The Viet Minh were operating all over the country, but control of Tonkin was critical. And so most of the battles took place there. Well, in the opening months of the war, through the early months of 1947, the Viet Minh launched all-out attacks on the French. They mobilized as many troops as they could, and they went head-to-head in what we call positional war against the French. A series of big battles occurred in this opening phase. The villages, most of whom were under communist control, the village militias helped to support the regular Viet Minh troops, and the Viet Minh attacked. However, this initial phase of the war turned out to be a disaster for the Viet Minh. because the French had tanks, they had artillery, they had above all air power, and the Viet Minh had none of these things. And so they were pulverized and thoroughly beaten in the first months of the war down to the middle of 1947. And indeed, by the summer, that is say 47, the Viet Minh commanders decided to break off these direct confrontations with the French and to revert essentially to guerrilla warfare. They could not go head to head with the French at this point, so they reverted to guerrilla warfare. And in the next months, they began to sort of try to figure out what to do. How could they deal with the French, who were more and more reinforcing themselves, both with troops from France, but also enlisting as many mercenary troops, Vietnamese mercenary troops as possible, while being, of course, with all of this heavy military firepower as well. So above all, they had already fought a guerrilla war against the Japanese through the Second World War to a certain extent. And they were extremely aware of what the Chinese had been doing for years. They began to seriously study what Mao Zedong had done in China in terms of guerrilla warfare, and they came to certain conclusions. The most important one I would say is that, yes, we have to imitate what the Chinese do, but our conditions, the basic conditions of war in Vietnam are different than they are in China, or they were in China, because Vietnam is a small country, whereas China is vast. And China to the west and China to the north, there are these huge areas. And the Chinese use these empty spaces, we could call them, the west and especially the north, as the rear, what we call the rear strategic area for their fight against the French, but against the Japanese, and also fighting against the nationalists. We're talking about Mao Zedong and the communists. In other words, they had these rear areas where they could take refuge and launch attacks as opportunities offered. But in Vietnam, it was not possible because small country, the French could strike anywhere in Vietnam. And therefore, they adopted a special kind of people's war. The term people's wars, or term Mao Zedong, Chinese, and so on. But people's war in Vietnam was different because they said they basically what has to happen is that the military forces of the Viet Minh have to support themselves on the people in the villages. They have to support themselves in the first place on the peasants organized in these village councils and the people's militia. That has to be the base of the military operation. They have to make, I'm quoting now, every house has to become a fortress. And they said, I'm quoting, the jungles and mountains where we base ourselves are in fact made up of the people. We can't hide in the jungles or in the mountains because the French can always find us, but they can't find us if we base ourselves and hide ourselves and depend upon the support of the people. So this tight organization based on the relationship between the Viet Minh and the villages and the structures, these village councils and village militias is the basis for the war effort, according to the military doctrines of the Vietnamese. So we have People's War in the first place. I'm coming to an end here, so bear with me. The second point is that this support amongst the people will give the Viet Minh tactical mobility, because the people know where the French are. They have a full understanding, full intelligence of where the French are moving, and they will supply the information which will allow the Viet Minh to maneuver very quickly from one place to another and strike out at the French. And we can use this tactical mobility to carry out a long-term conflict with the French, what's called protracted war. And basically, we can degrade, we can attrit, we can weaken although the French may be at the beginning, they may have all this firepower and so on, and heavy armament, we can gradually wear them down. We can inflict casualties, wounded and dead, and gradually undermine the French war effort. Meanwhile, we have to, of course, win over the people. This is a military conflict, but it's also an ideological conflict. We have to make propaganda. We have to appeal to the nationalism and to the economic injustice that the French have imposed on us. And so, first of all, we degrade, we're coming to an end, we degrade the French through this guerrilla warfare that I've just described, this people's war. And then when the French get weak enough, we can then return, we will gain strength while the French lose strength. And ultimately, we will drive them out by confronting the main forces of the French. We will transform the guerrilla operation over time into strong, regular troops who will defeat the French in battle. And this is exactly what they proceeded to do, as you'll see next time.
Excuse me, Professor.
Yes.
What did you guys talk about for the first 5 minutes of the class? First 5 minutes, just first 5 minutes.
We talked about American foreign policy and how it changed from being against the French coming back to Vietnam to basically supporting them. And the reason was basically the French, the Americans looked to the French in order, they wanted to build up the anti-communist forces in France itself. Communism was strong in France, and they wanted also to rebuild French military strength vis-a-vis the Russians. So the Americans began to support the French.
Okay, so essentially so it was more anti-communism essentially, and they just wanted another buffer zone in Europe, in that area essentially.
That's right.
Okay, thank you.
Is there any other?
No, after you told me that, and what I came back to was communism was strong in Italy and Greece, and then something about General de Gaulle had fled to England, and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Does anybody else have any?
I think it's just me and you in here.
We could have a seminar.
Yeah.
Okay.
Is this recorded?
It is, yeah.
Okay, I might. Yeah, could I have the recording? I came only 5 minutes late, but
the recording, yeah, there's a whole process.
Okay.
You'll have to wait later in the afternoon. It goes up.
Oh, okay. Is there a link to it, or how do I access it later?
It's on. You go onto YouTube and you'll find it.
YouTube. Do you have a link to your channel?
It's on, yeah, it's on, you just plug in Henry Heller, Vietnam War.
Okay, Henry Heller, Vietnam War on YouTube, and then it'll be on your channel, I guess.
Yeah,
Okay, thank you very much.
you're welcome.
Have a good day.